Good afternoon, Namibia, LPM sympathizers, voters all over the world. Welcome to the address on Sona. Now, I am Mutara Motu, the parliamentary spokesperson, and I'll be introducing a very exciting guest in our midst today. We're going to be looking at what does the Sona provide for Namibians. Now, my special guest is Mr. Herbert Jauch, a very staunch revolutionist in terms of a unionist. He is very much of a socialist, comes from a social background. He's a scholar. He's a man with vast experience. Mr. Herbert Jauch, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, we're not going to waste time. We're going to dive into it. What are your critical thoughts? What is your reflections on the SONA 2022? Did it do
Yeah.
justice?
Well, one must maybe place it in the context. It happened at a time when we probably have the biggest crisis in Namibia since independence. We have a crisis of housing with 300,000 houses in backlog. We have a crisis of mass unemployment. We don't have new figures, but before COVID, 4 years ago, we already had youth unemployment around 50%, general unemployment 34%, women around 38%. So that was already huge. Today, it's going to be much higher. And we have a crisis of increasing poverty. That linked to that, more and more households are sliding into poverty. Namibian households are structured normally that there's one major income earner who earns a wage somewhere, and the rest of the household lives off it. So a little bit here and there, still supplementary income, but basically they rely on that. Now, if that structure gets worse through COVID, through retrenchments, through wage reductions or wage freezes like some have experienced, and then the president talks of the state of the nation, then we would want to see some concrete interventions coming.
Yes.
Even if we would say it's not all government's fault, it's not all the president's fault, but we have this crisis, and so many Namibians don't know what to do next. And the desperation, and I'm sure when you travel in the regions through your consultations and meetings, you'll pick that up as well.
Definitely.
It's a desperate situation. Yeah. For workers whom I had worked for like 30 years or so in Namibia, the situation is extremely desperate to the point where even if they go on a strike, they hardly achieve anything substantial anymore. The situation is dire.
Sure.
And employers are, of course, telling workers now, well, there are so many others waiting for a job. If you don't like it, you can leave. So we face a scenario where things are really at breaking point, I would call it. Now, the president came with a SONA, good mood, all that.
Very happy.
Very relaxed
Yes.
after his trip to Dubai and elsewhere. And he started off just mentioning general points, like he mentioned the GDP growth after independence, the road network, that we have a social safety net, that government spent much in the social sector, like education, healthcare, that we have a free press, that in terms of gender equality, we made some progress. Now, good and well, but these things are more general pictures. And this State of the Nation address, in my view, shouldn't have just talked generally about Namibia in the last 32 years, but about Namibia today and the crisis that we've seen, particularly in the last 2 to 3 years. And what is government doing about it? And I think there, and we'll come to it in more details now, there it was a bit thin, you can put it there, in terms of concrete interventions. What are we doing to address that? And I think there it was probably a bit disappointing for Namibians across the country if they had expected something more concrete, more substantial. What will be happening to make my life a bit easier, to create new opportunities for those who are currently completely excluded? And I think that aspect has been missing at the SONA.
Interesting. Now, there are two substantial commercial wells in which the president identified in his address. One being the discoveries that were made in the Namibian seas by the international oil companies, by Total Energy and Shell Namibia. These are significant discoveries. But however, the potential that is set for Namibia in our new economical growth and the trajectory into growth is there is no contradiction between our ambitions in advancing our green economy and discovery for oil. Now, the question is the oil ours? Our government is sending mixed feelings, where Honorable Alwendo is saying, the minister is saying that the oil is ours. The president contradicting himself in the Al Jazeera interview, saying that the oil is not ours, it necessarily belongs to those who can afford it. What is your take on this?
Yes. My take is that there are two contradictions in terms of the president's statement. Number one, if Namibia wants to spearhead green ecology and clean energy in the years to come, which of course with our sunshine, we are, in terms of that raw material, abundantly blessed, then you would focus on renewables in Namibia. Wind energy, solar power, and now this green hydrogen. That would be the energy of the future. The United Nations have just this week confirmed for the world to have any chance of ecological survival in terms of stopping this global warming, we need to cut carbon emissions by 43% by 2030. 8 years from now, that's a very short period. Now, that raises the question, oil discoveries in Namibia now, in 2022, it takes on average 6 to 8 years from that discovery point to kind of moving online and being ready for sale. So if we move into oil, we're actually contradicting the claim of being a kind of green energy country.
Yeah,
we move
friendly
to the future. No, we're moving to the past. We're moving to an energy source that has been used in the last century, but needs to be increasingly phased out in the next few years already. So Namibia is part of the UN. Namibia positions itself as a source of green energy, but at the same time pins a lot of hope on oil. And that's the first contradiction. The second one is what you pointed out, whose oil is it? The minister is right. It's Namibia's oil. The resources on land and within the exclusive economic zone of Namibia at the sea belong to the state. What the president alludes to is that they sign these resources away in the deals with oil companies. So they're basically giving away those resources to the oil companies, and in return, they hope to get some royalties and taxes once it goes onshore. That's the core of this debate.
Now, there are various scholars that look at the issues around land grab, and they say that land grab is not necessarily just defined by grabbing the land itself, but the natural resources and the exploiting the labor. You also grab the labor. Now, in terms of these discoveries, how do you think the country will be able to manage the possible land grabs that will happen by these big corporate companies?
Yes. And this question applies to both the oil companies and the green hydrogen, because they will also need substantial tracts of land. And what is worrying is that these questions are not openly discussed, that the pros and cons are not tabled to the public at large, but that we're almost presented with a scenario where government has already taken a decision. Now, take it or leave it kind of attitude. And that is not going down well in terms of participatory democracy and opening up issues. And when we look at oil in Africa, we've seen how often it has become a curse. The classical case is Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, what happened there.
Exactly, yes.
So we've also not heard, how does Namibia want to avoid those kind of events taking place, where basically the benefits from oil in the end accrue with the oil companies, and the fallout and the negative consequences, and be it environmental or social consequences, are then carried by us again. And I think there we need to be very careful, because the oil industry is one of those capital intensive industries. If we want to solve our unemployment problem, we're not going to solve it through an oil company. Impossible.
Why do you think that?
Because they have a few rigs, they have a few highly specialized engineers on board, which they usually source internationally because these are global companies. And particularly when there's no refinery of oil taking place and no further processing, then this oil will basically put into barrels and shipped out. And we've seen in Nigeria, for example, it has done very little in terms of job creation.
It has,
And it has actually put the people in the area where the oil is found at a big disadvantage because it destroyed their livelihood. That was one of the most fertile areas in Nigeria. Fresh water in abundance, agricultural production taking place, fishing, local fishing industry flourishing, all destroyed through oil. And the parallel here would be the oil drilling in the Kavango region, that also with Recon Africa is proposed or is underway actually as we speak. The president didn't mention them in the Sona. We focused on the one on oil. So with the oil industry, they're from several angles. We need to be very careful and we need to be strategic in our negotiations that the benefits come to Namibians on a large scale and not just a few dollars in taxes to government. It must be more that we get out of, if we decide to even utilize the oil fund. For ecological reasons, there's a lot of debate if that should still happen today.
Yeah, definitely. Now let's really look into the investment. $9 billion is what they expect to attract. Namibia is expecting to attract. But additionally, we expect these investments to produce 5 gigawatts of green energy, 2 million tons of ammonia, and a significant employment opportunities for Namibia. But leasing out the green schemes, they say, is open to all entrepreneurs, both local and internationally. This idea was sold to potential investors in Dubai, the recent Dubai Expo.
Yes.
But then, given our past experiences, that have indicated that this investment leads to importation of so-called experts, labor abuse of Namibian workers, nepotism is high, local companies contracted by elites for their own purposes and their own greed. As a labor expert, if you look at these investments and a front unionist, what would you say this promise, is it not a repetition of what has happened elsewhere all over in the country in terms of mining industry construction, where they have been taken over by the foreigners?
Yes, and that is the big worry. Farming is an activity that happened in Namibia since people settled here, even long before colonialism. Farming along the rivers was particularly productive because water was available all the time. And to now say we are not able to farm and to run green schemes locally sounds to me very far-fetched. I saw in the news recently also some farmers in the area said this absolutely makes no sense.
It doesn't, yeah.
What it provides, the green scheme, is an opportunity to set up for local farmers kind of cooperative farming ventures. That's the golden opportunity that it provides. Because you have a basic infrastructure in place. Maybe it was poorly managed before, but on a cooperative farming basis, you could share the equipment and share some of the infrastructure amongst farmers in the region and then make them productive. Secondly, you do what AgriBank did with some other of the farming ventures, namely you give quotas in local shops in terms of fresh produce. So at the moment it's about 40% that they must source locally. If you do that and you increase it maybe to 50 or 60%, then the shops will have to look for local suppliers. So you create an immediate market for those farmers.
Definitely.
They are not thrown to the wilderness. GIPF had a small scheme with the blueberries, which seems to have run quite successfully. Now, hard up scheme we have established. The Nekadal Dam will provide another opportunity to do that. Now we must use those infrastructure that we have and especially the water resources very wisely. And it has the two effects there. Number one, you create consistent incomes for farmers. You create sustainable local jobs with it. And thirdly, you create greater food self-sufficiency. And we've seen now with the Ukraine war and Russia's invasion there, how that has affected wheat prices and sunflower oil, the cooking oil, all of them shoot through the roof in terms of prices. So greater food self-sufficiency is also an aspect for Namibia. And I think when we look at those opportunities, there should be a possibility to do it locally because people have been farming. And it's a matter of how to organize them. And maybe instead of bureaucrats from government running schemes, it would be more on a workers' cooperative basis. Running it. But one can look, and people involved will know the details better than any outsider.
Yeah.
But certainly it must be possible that we run such schemes
Yeah,
successfully.
definitely.
In Namibia.
Now, the SONA speech seemed to be centered around pro-youth development, allocating 45 million Namibian dollars to the Development Bank of Namibia for the purposes of youth in entrepreneurship and financing their facilities. Now, if we quote the draft on the public procurement Code of Good Practice by the Minister of Finance, it further provides for provincial treatment in terms of reservation for youth-owned businesses for contracts valued at 50 million Namibian dollars or less. Now, with these so many stumbling blocks around how youth get business financed, how they get their businesses financed, and does not look into the areas of collateral that is required, what guarantee is that this monies that is being invested will reach the targeted population and not end up in the hands of the elites in terms of them allocating this money to their own children and then going back into their pockets?
That's always the big risk with such schemes, and it's not the first time. We had all kinds of SME support schemes.
Yes.
We had the infamous SME banks that then collapsed spectacularly under a cloud of suspicion. How that collapse was arranged and why it was so easy for those responsible to just skip the country. So if there are not proper structures in place and proper criteria that are utilized to screen, then that can very well happen once more. The second challenge is that in a depressed economy like ours, where spending power is reduced, where people just keep the money for more and more, just the very essentials to keep alive. Even existing small businesses are struggling. That maybe did some security features with housing or fencing and so on. There are a lot of these small businesses that we have, and even they struggle to survive. Now you provide a loan to a young person that enters the same market and the same conditions. And what are the chances of survival? They are then very small, even if the person is very hardworking. So we need to look at this economic environment in which we start small businesses. And the nice thing is when you have a broad grant, that you have an effect on both, and that we've seen in Oshivero. The small businesses that started there, like a little bakery or clothing that's been sewn, could then be sold in the community because the grant provided them with some income. Now, if you only look at the kind of supply side, only the business, and people say, well, it's nice what Tara is offering, I'd love to buy that, but I have no money.
True. Exactly.
And this is, I think, where the whole focus of youth needs to be thought through in the broader context. We can't anymore just look at one intervention like these loans and say, okay, as long as Utara gets the loan, but then she's on her own. You survive on your own. And business survival rates generally are quite low. It's a struggle. But in a depressed economy like ours, it takes almost a miracle to get through. So you need to look at issues how to support those businesses in the longer run. Even in industrialized countries, they sometimes have a 2-3 year support program for emerging businesses before they're really thrown to the market. And we've seen it with our resettlement farms, when people are merely given the farm or a section of a farm and no further support, how they struggle to make ends meet. And I think this is my worry a bit with the small business as well. If young people only get at the beginning a startup support, and then now good luck and goodbye.
Good luck.
Find your own way.
Yes, for those who are tuning in, we are currently unpacking the Sona with Mr. Herbert Jauch. If you're tuning in, please do write your comments in the comment section below. Send your questions, any comment that you would want us to answer, and we will definitely unpack. Moving back to you, sir. In terms of NASFAF, the president announced amnesty to NASFAF debt repayments for a period around 12 months. What are your thoughts with this regard?
Short term, that's definitely welcome, especially since so many of the graduates don't find work. So a 12-month amnesty is for the short term certainly something that lessens the pressure. But what then? And this is the point that with such structural crisis like we're having, you can't just have a little sweetener here and another sweetener there. You need to look at that whole system of NASFAF. You need to address the question of youth unemployment and graduate unemployment as part of that. Because if we don't do that, then the same group of people will be in the same position in a year from now. Then what are we going to do next? Another amnesty, or what will happen? And I think while it's a temporary relief, it doesn't. This measure doesn't address the root cause.
It doesn't.
And it is still based on the assumption that when students, and it was of course for 10, 20 years after independence, when you managed to get a degree, you were almost guaranteed a job. There were very few unemployed graduates. It's very different today.
So one could say it's the step in the right direction, but it's the baby steps that are worrisome, and the focus on just one issue, like for instance, the loans, and so long, goodbye, you are on your own. So that is, what you're saying is that we should expand in terms of our policies, supportive policies to these issues that we're bringing up. So those are your centered points, if I get you, if I got you right. If I just have to bring the layman's terms quickly.
No, it is, and to see that in an economically depressed scenario, we need to be bold enough to counter it. You can't counter a recession, or actually we're close to a depression. That we've gone for so many years on a recess. Yeah, formally the economy is growing, but in terms of jobs, we haven't seen the turnaround yet. And this is also sometimes with economic statistics the difficulty. They say, the exports have grown from Namibia because on international markets the raw material prices has increased. But that doesn't translate into anything for Namibia. It merely increases the income of mining companies, but nothing further. And that is the difficulty. We need an economy that grows in terms of jobs and living standards. It doesn't help us if we have a growth on paper, but it doesn't translate into better lives for people in the country. And that's the difficulty in the economic debate, where so many mainstream economists just look at what do the figures tell them. We need to look at livelihoods, at jobs, and at better standards of living.
Definitely. Before we go into one of your favorite topics, which is the basic income grants, which is something that's close to your heart, I just really wanted to take you to our statistics. Now, the Namibian Statistics Agency is a very important institution in terms of providing stats to help back up policy formulation, to also give an idea to where we're going as a country in terms of some stats on poverty, stats on gender-based violence, etc. Now, I had a good conversation with some of the economists and statisticians at the Namibian Statistics Agency. And the reflection around that, there is a growing concern that we are basing current policy, introducing policies on old stats that are not yet being renewed. So why is it that Namibia keeps on pivoting their focus away from NSA? I mean, in order to know, in fact, like what he did in terms of increasing the disability grant, based on what stats? So it's very important, and it's very concerning, because you're basing it on 2015 model in terms of poverty, but that it doesn't reflect even what COVID-19 has done to the economy. So why is it, in your view, that Namibia is not focusing on NSA? In fact, they released that they needed a specific amount, which was counted by so many people. But then still they feel that they are not necessarily supported in terms of the government pushing, fast tracking the census and etc. What is it that we need to do for NSA?
You're absolutely spot on, and it's quite shocking because a few years ago there was talk of evidence-based policies. So that you look at what is happening, you look at the trends, you look at figures, and your policies and interventions are based on that, which of course makes a lot of sense. For example, if you have, like in South Africa, they have quarterly employment and unemployment trends. So every 3 months, you know, is what we're doing going in the right direction, or are we seeing a continuous decline in jobs? Now, several years ago, I was invited at the NSA when we looked at the labor statistics, particularly the labor force surveys. And it was agreed by everyone there that the very minimum is we need it annually, every year, to see which industries are growing, which ones are shedding, what about wage gap between men and women, and so on. So you need to know what's happening in the country to intervene and to address the problems that you face. Now, because of cost cutting, the last labor force survey is 2018, 4 years ago. We can't use figures from before COVID if we talk of unemployment today. And at this point, it's guesswork. No one has actual figures. Likewise, what you said, our discussion about poverty and how many Namibians are poor are based on 2015 figures, the household income and expenditure survey. And all the events since then, the economic problems, the COVID crisis, all that is not factored into. The World Bank tried to now assess Namibia in terms of an upper middle income country, and they found that about 1.6 million people are living in poverty. That would be huge. That's like 2 out of 3 Namibians. And then NSA counted based on their figures to say, no, it's only about 400,000. Now, if we have discussions like that about who is poor, about how many people are unemployed, based on figures that are 4 or 7 years old, then it becomes almost speculative. And particularly poverty levels and standards of living are crucial to monitor alongside unemployment. So that you really understand how deep the problem is and what can be done to rectify it. And it must be very frustrating for the NSA to being cut out. And it basically means cabinet now has to take decision without any up-to-date accurate statistic. It's kind of guessing.
Sure.
And that is very worrying.
Yeah.
Because
definitely.
you must have that as a basis for decision making. And then you prioritize also such statistics. And of course, there's not much you can do in cutting corners. A survey must be done properly to provide you with those data. But if you want to act on what's happening, if you want to design effective interventions, you need the data. And then also to measure that intervention that we did, what effects did it have? And it's interesting that, of course, all outdated and long, but the social protection policy now admits that the social grants have had a major impact on poverty reduction in Namibia. Now, things like that are important.
Yeah, very.
Very important that these old age pensions have a major impact on poverty reduction in Namibia. Because if we know that, then we know, that's the way to go. And if they are ineffective in doing it, then it's also important to say, well, we tried that, but it didn't work. So let us revise our strategy. But following it up with research and data and seeing what's happening, how are people's life changing, is very crucial for me. And if we want evidence-based policy, which is what the administration promised 7 years ago, then you need the data. Otherwise, there's no evidence on which you base your policy.
Scary times indeed. I think when you explain it to me now, I'm actually freaking out, because what if we are making the wrong policies based on the wrong stats? Will it even make an impact? Is what we need to ask ourselves. Now, in terms of the basic income grant, the consolidation of the food bank into modified conditional basic income grant in the form of cash transfers of 500 Namibian dollars will go a long way to provide the daily necessities and boost microeconomic activities within the communities. Now, the question is, you have been a long proponent of the basic income grant, but what do you say to this? Is the government eventually conceding, warming up to the BIG concept after so many years? What is wrong, or what was wrong in the first instance with the food bank model?
Yeah, that is the question that sometimes keeps us awake at night. Because after the initial pilot project of the basic income grant, and we took, it was before your time, we took the parliamentary standing committees actually to Oshibero and said, you don't have to believe us. Go there, spend the day, talk to people, find out for yourself. And they came from different political parties. And at the end of that day, they were all convinced that this is the way to go. It was in President Pohamba's time still. And with our current president, Dr. Gainko, he was more than just interested. He actually even co-supported, co-funded the pilot project, donated something alongside many other people. And he came to our events to learn about what has it done. We also had an exchange with the Brazilian government on the Workers' Party there, President Lula's party, because they had introduced the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, something similar to a BIG, not quite, but similar, with great success. And we had meetings here for a Brazilian senator, and our current president was part of the discussion. And he was actually quite convinced that this is something that can help us eradicate poverty and make sure that nobody is left out. And when he then appointed our long-standing chair of the commission as Minister of Poverty Eradication, Bishop Dr. Stefania Kameta, we were told, look, it's a done deal. The BIG is going to come now. And the minister, then Dr. Kameta, just asked us to be on standby and help him and his ministry to roll it out, which we, of course, the coalition, we all said, of course, you don't have to employ us. This, we believe in this, and we will assist in whichever way. Then it did not happen, and we were wondering now what's happening. We were never given an explanation. Why not? Because we must also recall 2015, 2016, the finances of the country were not dire like they are now. We could have fairly easily afforded a basic income grant. Instead, then came the idea of a food bank. So we wondered, what is that? And it's problematic on two grounds. Number one, poverty is not just food. Sometimes poverty is you don't have the taxi money for the child to get to school. You don't have the $5 to go into a clinic, which we discovered in Ochivero. There's a government clinic. What kept people away from that clinic were $5 at the time. That's what they asked. When the BIG was paid out, the $5 was no longer an issue. So the clinic all of a sudden had 5 times as many patients because people that were sick could now use it. So for the clinic was most excited about that, to see our services are now being utilized by this community. And so the food bank doesn't consider any of that. It gives you, here's your packet of milli meal and fish or whatever it is, or corned beef, and a packet of vegetables with it. Do with it whatever you need to. And it doesn't take into consideration people's needs. Secondly, it is not protecting people's dignity. If you give me in front of cameras now a food parcel, and now I must be grateful, it is a degrading exercise in itself. Poverty is a terrible thing. It's a violation of human rights in itself. Now to still parade it, to say the poor must now come forward and apply for the food bank. And if you stand in that queue, then your community sees you as a failure. So it's also from that aspect highly problematic. And thirdly, it's very it's almost arbitrary because it's not, you don't go into an area and say, now here we can see this is an impoverished area. Everyone gets it. No, they go from house to house and then decide, no, Tara doesn't need to get it, but your neighbor gets it. But your conditions can change. You might lose your job.
Exactly.
Nothing else. The neighbor might pick up a job in the meantime somewhere. So now you must say, oh, sorry. We take the food parcel here and we rather give it to Uttara. So it was this chopping and changing. And it gives also the bureaucrats enormous power. If I can decide who gets the parcel and who doesn't, who knows what deals I can make.
Control, yes.
But the bureaucrats are in charge. Now you are poor, you already have to now admit your poverty to an outsider that comes with papers to tick and determine must you get it or not. And so on all these grounds, the food bank cannot be compared to the basic income grant. It's something totally different, and it's very confusing that it's now called a revised basic income grant. It's not. And you look at the numbers, and that maybe shows how insignificant it is. Even government's figures talk of 400,000 people in poverty, but the food bank reaches just about 40,000, 45,000. So it's about 1 of 10 people that in government's own definition is poor. In reality, it's many more. Other agencies that did their surveys have come up with much higher poverty figures. So when you have such a scenario, why would you give that cash grant to a few and you leave out the majority? When the president in his own words said, nobody should be left out. Now we can't have a scheme that leaves 95% of the poor out. No, that is in my view really not good enough. There we must be bold and say, now, to reach all, what needs to be done in terms of our incomes? How can we improve revenue? How can we shift in the budget? But we must live up to what we promised. And you remember that time and how high the hopes were with that Sona, his first Sona, 7 years ago, when he said nobody must be left out. And we were all finally,
right? And he used it as a political gimmick, basically.
That's where,
There's no reflection of nobody's left behind. Most of people are left behind nowadays based on political affiliation, poverty. We are really in pressing times indeed. If you're just joining us now, we just looked into the basic income grant, the question on the basic income grant, looking at what is wrong with the food bank model, and do we really need to go back to the drawing board in terms of the income grant. Now we look at another aspect, is the children and disability grant. With the value of the grant being increased to 5-fold, from a current 250 Namibian dollars to now 1,300 Namibian dollars, effective from the 2023 financial year. What is your take on this? Is this good? Is it a good sign, given that our poverty statistics are 2015, based on 2015? It also says, how did he come with this calculation? Based on what? And what sign of the economy did he say that? Because he said apparently the economy is growing to 2.4% of growth.
Yes.
Please, can you give us your reflection on that?
I wish what it was based on. This was one of the surprising announcements.
Yeah.
But it was limited to a fairly small number of children, namely children with disabilities. It was not general child grants. It was for one group of people, if I read the speech correctly.
Yes.
And now I have absolutely no problem with it because disabilities require special care and require additional costs. But it's a limited number of children. Why the 1,300 came about, he couldn't explain, and I wouldn't be able either.
Exactly.
Is it to put it at the same like the old age pension, because they were at 1.3? That's why. So it's not quite clear. What the government's own social protection policy, the draft of 2019, said was something very different. They found that these different children's grants, you have vulnerable children, you have orphans, you have children with disability, that the bureaucratic hurdles to get that money, particularly for impoverished households, are very high. They don't know where to go. Then they get pushed around by bureaucrats in ministries, and they can't read the forms in English, or no one helps them kind of complete them. And so many people who should get the grants were excluded. And the other aspect was you needed to prove your income. So you got only certain grants if you earned less than $1,000 a month. So now you have a woman that's a mother, single mother of three, who works at a retail shop for 1,200 or 1,300. Now, according to the criteria, she should not get it because she earns over that threshold. And things like that happen. And there I was quite impressed in the 2019 policy, where government said, this does not work. We should rather than have a universal child grant. The child grant can't remain at the 250. It should immediately be raised to around 330 and then increase further. So they saw over a few years that the child grants get systematically increased because of costs of living. So there was an argument, your evidence-based. They said, no, the 250 don't cut it, given the cost of living of raising a child. So they proposed a 3-4-step adjustment. Now the president has not followed that advice. He picked out one group of children, only those with disability, and then it's a 5-fold jump in one go. Why he has done that? But for all other children, the vulnerable, those with the orphans, it remains the same. So they're still stuck at the 250 for now, it seems. And this is where one misses the consistency. It's a nice announcement for that group of children. I have no problem with it. But what about the others that are affected by poverty? And I think there we need to once more look at the bigger picture and the problem as a whole. And how do we tackle poverty? And I think a universal child grant for all the children that systematically raised to reasonable levels that you need to survive, that would have had a much bigger impact for the country as a whole. And that's the pity. We seem to hop on certain quick fix or certain, almost the cherry on the cake.
Yes.
But we're not addressing what's underneath. And that we have a big problem that requires bold steps to address it.
Exactly. Now, the president boasted following that he has achieved with regard to land in terms of housing, sanitation during the period, and he has serviced about 1,252 service plots countrywide, 1,282 housing units delivered through the central government funding local authorities and private developers. But if you look at his speech during his first inauguration in 2015, the president promised about 250,000 housing units to be built during his tenure. What is your opinion in terms of this shift and this inability to reach that target? And what is your opinion about the slow pace in the government's initiative on housing?
Exactly. These two figures that you contrast, they say it all. In fact, recently, I think last year I said, we have a backlog of about 300,000 units. But be it as it may, let's take the 250. We have now, in that year, built 1,200 and serviced another 1,200. At that pace, it takes us 20 years to just address, 200 years to just address the backlog.
200.
In 10 years, we would then have built like 12,000. In 100 years, 120,000. Now, just to look at the pace, what do you say then to Namibians is that this housing crisis will continue forever. They're of course reviewing now the national housing policy, but when you look at the figures that we see now, this is a drop in the ocean.
It is a drop.
And if you want 250,000, then you must look at a figure of around minimum 30, 40,000 a year to make any dent in people's lifetime. And we are light years away from that. And it was, of course, coming for a long time. The National Housing Enterprise, they often had like 600-700 houses being built a year, also completely removed from housing reality in terms of the needs. And so our housing crisis has been growing and growing and growing, and that's why we're now close to 40-50% of Namibians living in shacks, simply because houses have become totally unaffordable. Now, that again requires bold interventions. How are we going to solve that? And other countries like Uruguay or Venezuela or Cuba, they have kind of workers' cooperatives and housing brigades to address the issue on a large scale. So they are managing to produce hundreds of thousands of units, whereas we seem to still be stuck in our normal way of doing things. There must be a contractor and a tender, and then we build a few houses here and a few there, and we pay a lot of money for land servicing as well. And so the process is very, very slow. And it requires also a rethink at that level, unless we say, well, we must just live with it, that most Namibians live in check. And there with the sanitation issue it was interesting, it focused only on the bucket system. Now the bucket system is just one small aspect. I think the last figures we had, the statistics spoke about over 40% of Namibians using the bush as their toilet. Not a bucket system, just the bush, particularly in rural areas, but even in our urban centers now.
Yeah, indeed.
Now, when you have such a crisis, you cannot just say we abolish 200 buckets or whatever when the problem is so much bigger. And you can't celebrate 200 houses when your backlog is 250,000.
Now, given the fact that you stated something very interesting, saying that it will take about a period of 10 years to build 12,000 units, if I'm correct.
At that pace.
At that pace, the current pace.
Yes.
Now, 250,000, wasn't that statement too ambitious? And it makes me think that why were these figures not challenged before? I mean, why do we just sit and allow for 1,252 plots to be serviced countrywide and still do not tackle? Maybe now it's the job of obviously the opposition politicians and academics and so forth. We need to really ensure that we strengthen in terms of holding him accountable to 250,000 units, because it's ridiculous pace that he's really currently in his administration is currently going at. And obviously we know that obviously with what we are doing in terms of the regions, what we're going through in terms of where we're governing and other positions are governing, is that the government is strategically closing the tap in terms of the budget to make it very difficult for us to service plots with a very limited budget that was given to us. So there's also administrative faults and technicalities that we are going through, and I think seriously it needs for a like you said, a radical transformation in terms of the policy, because we need to fasten the pace. So which other countries do you think we should look at in terms of copying their models? Brazil?
Okay, copying is a bit difficult because you need to look at the specific circumstances that we have. But I found just reading and hearing about Uruguay, Venezuela interesting. Also housing in Singapore, which was driven by government and state-funded flats, which they then made affordable rents available to people, and after a while they could buy it. So we have countries that have, with quite a bit of success, addressed that. In Namibia, we have the Shack Dwellers Federation of Namibia, which has as a membership-based group, managed to deliver houses at a fraction of the cost of NHE, where members build themselves and they assist each other. So the new housing policy that's now being kind of developed and finalized would need to guide the way here, and would need to very concretely outline how is that going to be achieved. And it's going to be a mix. It can't be just like the mortgage type housing scheme, which is a minority of Namibians that can run to a bank to get a bank loan and buy a house. So you need to look at other models as well. Shack Dwellers Federation is one. We had the old Samstan housing cooperatives, rental accommodation for people that, let's say, as a young person, you go to a certain region or town for a few years. You would not necessarily want to stay there forever and buy a house, but you need affordable rental. So the housing mix needs to be different. There are people at NAST and elsewhere that work on these aspects and drawing that in and with the practical experience of the Shack Dwellers Federation and others who study the particular housing models, we should be able to come to something and stop kind of some thumb-sucking numbers, throwing them out because they look good, and then have no strategy in place how to get there. And that is, I think, with these two issues, the housing one, 250,000 will be built, is one, but also poverty will be eradicated, not just reduced, eradicated. We do away with poverty. If you make statements like that, you must be willing to then knuckle down and say, this is the aim, and it must be achieved not in 500 years' time, it must be achieved in a reasonable time. Now, what do we need to do to get there? And these are the strategies that you then roll out. And that's maybe the part that we all are missing at the moment. These statements are just made, grand statements. Okay, politicians sometimes do that to sound good. That's fine, that's their job. But when you are in government, when you are head of government, your job is not just to promise, your job is to make sure these things are happening. And I think this is the time where people don't want to hear empty promises anymore. And this was, by comparison, the BIG would not have held promises. It would have made a difference in people's life. And so we see that the doable things were not done, and instead other things were promised that had currently no chance of realization. And that's a pity, because then you discourage a point of disillusionment sets in. Oh, we heard it all before. But remember, this was promised and that was promised, and nothing changed.
The issue of genocide. How did the president handle this in Sona?
I was surprised, because no one has ever accused him of being behind the genocide or being involved. Why was he so touchy about it? And the genocide is something that remains unresolved until also affected communities and their descendants say, we can live with that. There is, of course, never a reparation that can ever take away the pain and the injustice. But if we negotiate for reparations as a government on behalf of Namibia, you must take those directly affected. And I know you made a very touching speech in Parliament where you link that history to your own life and history.
Myself,
Exactly. Because these things are not just something that you read in history books. They affect people for a long time. Just like the apartheid history, they shaped our lives and thinking and reality till today. So we can't sweep that off clearly. Maybe what government would need to admit is the difficulty of negotiating with the Germans, which they have said to some extent, that they want to avoid the term reparations and the guilt that would require them to do that. But then government shouldn't maybe rush to sign deals and say, we are happy with this arrangement, and then face the music at home when they report back. And so many of them have been saying, well, you have not represented us. So the kind of participatory democracy and the Namibian government being a negotiator, but also facilitator for the affected groups to be part of the negotiations. And ultimately, no one can accept a kind of gesture or reparation on behalf of victims. It's only the victims themselves that can say, this is acceptable to us. And it's a difficult task for government. I would admit that they are on thin ice here on the one hand dealing with an obnoxious government position in Germany. We don't want to hear about reparation. We don't want to be sued, all that. But at home, there's also this longing that this genocide issue is addressed comprehensively and in a way that people whose families have suffered the consequences can say, the pain will not go away, but this is an acceptable symbolic gesture that we can live with. More it can't be, but at least that must be achieved. Otherwise, this thing is not going to go away.
Yeah, definitely. Now, if we look into agriculture, another interesting issue, and the agrarian reform question, and by extension, the land reform question, has not been addressed. Those were words alluded by Honorable Swartboy. And in fact, he stated that we are still a farming nation, and for us to achieve a capitalist industrialization, we need to embark on the capitalist agrarian reform. What are your thoughts in terms of this? How do we address agriculture? How did we do justice in the budget?
No, and not only in this one, generally, agriculture was and still is a major employer in Namibia. But we haven't managed to change our structure of agriculture and especially agro industries, to build up agro industries in the process. And that is, of course, always the trick, that you move from, let's say, a mango producing farmer for self-sufficiency to a mango producing farmer that produces much more than just the family and becomes a supplier to the national economy. Going with that is the question then of why would we have groundnuts, for example, at the Etunda grain scheme that are lying there in heaps, waiting to be shipped or transported to South Africa. And then we import the peanut butter based on it. So when you have certain agricultural products that you can produce in the country, you need to look at then the processing, the agro industries that come from that. And there's another one that has hardly been talked about, and you're quite right, in the Sona, it was absent this time altogether. There is this question of the invader bushes that in many regions have affected large tracts of land. Now that invader bush could be harvested and turned, number one, into school furniture, number two, into boards for building industries, for improving housing. That is another example of what we can do when we focus on that. So that agriculture is not just the primary agriculture, it must be the further processing. And of course, the big companies, they produce now milk and yogurts and some cheese. And in other regions, that's not happening. People are still farming the way they did maybe 100 years ago. And that's where your point comes in, agrarian reform, more than just land reform. That must also happen. But the utilization of land, the building of agro industries, the systematic expansion, and around that, creating many and ongoing jobs for people. That has been completely absent in this Sona. And it is a bit surprising because the land reform is actually, when you look at those statistics that we have, I think they're 3 years old now, that 70% of commercial farms in Namibia are owned by white men. Then you wonder, wow, 32 years after independence, that when at the time of the Second Land Conference, a Russian billionaire buys up several farms around Dodabis, and then it's coded into, well, it's only lease for 99 years. 99 years, this is like virtually the colonial period of Namibia.
About 70,000 hectares to be correct.
My word. Now, this all, there you see a disconnect. On what basis can we justify that happening? And to make matters worse, Namibian farm workers were evicted from their farm and are sitting there along the road to Dodabis. When you go off that road, there's still some of them sitting there. Now, there you see there is no coherent thought about land use, about redistribution, about resettlement,
Yes.
about both gender and
very important.
racial justice,
Yes.
because it's a small minority
Yes.
of farm owners who are women. So it has a gender and a color base
It is.
bias. And I think 32 years after independence, we should have a different scenario. And in fact, that was what we promised ourselves at the time of independence, that these things would change. And yeah, it's a bit, it's another of those issues where the urge to change, the urge to make most of the resources we have, land, agriculture, going into agri-industry, instead of just looking at foreign investors. Because agro-industries can often be, and you and your colleagues know that much better than me, they can be initiated locally. You don't need big bang investments. You don't need some billionaire pumping it in you. You build on existing capacity with guided and strategic state support. Of course, you provide that, but you have large dams in Namibia around which you can do that. And we don't need foreign investment for all that. We can twist also the regulations about, for example, pension funds, that a larger portion gets invested locally. And then you don't need investors from Dubai or China or Germany or elsewhere to do that. You have your own capital base. And after all, what we pay into pension fund is our savings, Namibian savings.
Exactly.
Why are we not using our own savings to develop our own country? Why are we saying it's good enough if most of our savings are invested elsewhere? And these are the things where other kind of developmental states, like some of those in Asia, have done things very differently. They didn't say, come and do whatever you like in our country, we're happy if you come. They said, no, we were only looking in these and these and these sectors. The rest we do ourselves. And if you come, we link you with locals straight away, because you might go again after a few years. We are here to stay. So we ensure that if that happens, the process continues, and we have our agro-based industrialization. And these are things that are possible, and it needs a bit of drive to get going on that.
Yeah. Now, final point that we're going to look into is the statement that was also made by Honorable Swartboy, where he spoke, and I'll go into details, where he spoke about the disparity in terms of how capital budgets are being distributed in regions. For example, he said, Nkoriha's got a budget of 900,000, while Kitman's got a budget of 2 million. Rundu, which is far bigger than Oshakati, if we look at per capita, got 5 million last year, while Oshakati got 50 million. Aranos, which is proclaimed a town of more than 8 years ago, is still like a village council. And while some cannot be said about Umthia or Wakana, these are the structural injustices that we have to deal with. And he linked it to Galton's theory of structural institutionalized violence, that we're still not a peaceful country in terms of development and how we distribute our funds. Now, the question is, given Namibians' history where demographic divisions are still visible due to apartheid, divide and rule policy, and it is not legitimate concern that some regions are left behind and others are not developed as compared to other regions, the question comes in mind again. Is it perhaps time that we introduce a quota system per region, given in mind of the blowing revelation of how budgets and capital projects are being funded?
This is was for me also quite surprising to see such discrepancies. Quotas could be one way of considering that. Maybe more importantly is to agree on the formula, on what basis are funds allocated. And that must take into account, number one, of the number of people, but also the state of neglect, the state of disadvantage in those regions. It's a bit like the education reform we've seen after independence, where government said, okay, now we give the same amount for each child, which of course was better than the colonial one, where they said if you are under the Avambo administration, you get this one. If you're under the Herrero administration, you get so much. If you're under the Nama administration, but if you're under the white administration, then you get 10 times as much per child. So that was blatant discrimination. With independence, we then said, okay, now we give each school so much per child. Better than before. But there were schools who had laboratories already from the colonial period, who had sports grounds, well-established infrastructure. And there were schools who were basically under the tree or just a few zinc sheets put together. Now we're saying we're treating them equally. Is that equity? Is that fairness? Is that social justice? It's not. So besides looking at the number of people, we also need to look at the needs and the conditions, and then have a formula that takes that into account so that we have a kind of leveling over time. That's absolutely essential. Otherwise, we perpetuate the inequalities that we inherited. And in education, we see that. I remember when I still was also in the teachers' union, when you looked at the school results, top results tended to be the expensive private schools. Then came the former white schools. Then came the urban black schools, and then came the kind of rural schools at the bottom end. And that happens when you don't equalize conditions and opportunities. So for children, their chances in life were then determined which kind of schools could they go to. And your example points to maybe a similar danger in terms of regions, where you are, what your chances are, what your living conditions are. So I think this is an important point where I can't now claim to provide a solution, but it's an important point to consider, because otherwise you get a sense of certain regions feel discriminated and others feel that these ones are chosen because maybe of political allegiances or whatever, and we are neglected. That's a dangerous trend in terms of social cohesion. You must use budgets and services to equalize to the highest possible level and not to divide further. But this is definitely an important point to consider.
Thank you for that. Now we have come to our end of very exciting, and was very impactful in terms of the engagement. I myself have gotten so many points that I want to now write down quickly after the discussion to really advocate for in Parliament. What are your final thoughts? What do you have to say to the Namibian nation?
I think the difficulties that people are facing right now, and the challenges that are mounting, can lead to a point where you almost want to give up. And I hope we're not going to give up. And this is the country we have. We must start utilizing the chances that are there and the opportunities. And they are there, and there were proposals. And that's from the agrarian reform to other forms of housing delivery, to ensuring that the basics are met through a basic income grant, to also ensure that state revenues is dramatically improved, and there is, by comparison, even in the region, huge space for doing that. So I hope that fellow Namibians, we're not going to give up now and become depressed about the state of affairs, but they say, no, let's turn that around. And let's work on the possible solutions and move into another direction. And it requires quite a few changes from the way we've been doing things, but it is possible. And that is the one thing of human history, is nothing is prescribed and cast into stone. We can do things differently, and we must adjust our development strategy to what we need and what our people need here.
Now, something that I just wanted to point out, which was very profound and touched me greatly, what you stated. And I think something that we can also look into the next big discussion is the discussion on who is poor. That really, your statement really touched me, and how people deal with in terms of the control of power and their resources, and how they ensure others probably strategically remain poorer than others. something we really need to look into as the Landless People's Movement in terms of policy development debates. I think it's an interesting also topic on research, basically, for masters and postgraduate and exactly other institutions. I think really touched me greatly, and I didn't really look at it in such a very academic point of view and structural point of view as well. Thank you so much for that. Your discussion was very much you could see the vast experience that you had in terms of labor, in terms of BIG. We are really definitely going to use all your inputs in terms of next week's discussion on Tuesday, in terms where we break down the votes and discuss further, where we can also ask some of these questions on the BIG, what you said in terms of whether do we go back to the drawing board? What happened? Why is it still something that is not being implemented fully yet? And where can we help in terms of ensuring that we structure it in a way that it works for the ministry? It's an important thing we need to look into. And also another disparity that you looked at, inequalities in terms of how children and with disabilities, it's great, the grant is great. No one is disputing that. But how other vulnerable children are strategically being excluded, that's another issue we really need to look at in the housing. I could go into so many, but it's going to be another discussion. But I just really want to thank you for your input. It was very much profound, and I'm sure the viewers also found it very interesting. Now, LPM supporters, LPM voters, Namibian nation, we have come to the end. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is the Chambers Update with Utaramoto. We will be further in having our discussions on Tuesday. Tune in next week, Tuesday. We will start our discussions on the budget votes, where we will break them down into specific votes on, for instance, the presidency, the votes on agriculture, education, etc. You still have a chance to bring your inputs. Please do write, DM us, write us an email, or even just put your comments in this comment section below on what we should focus so that you can help shape the Namibia you want to live in. Good, and have a good evening.